The wind howled across the barren plain, sweeping through the skeletal remains of winter grass and rattling the warped shutters of a weather-beaten house. Elias stood at the edge of his porch, shoulders rigid beneath his worn duster, staring at the horizon as if waiting for something that had long since given up on him. The evening sky was bruised with the deep purples of an approaching storm, clouds gathering like a slow, relentless tide. He welcomed the quiet before it broke. Silence had become his only companion. Inside, the house was clean but lifeless, a place where every object served a purpose and nothing more. The chair beside the hearth remained empty, untouched for years, its cushion permanently shaped by a woman who would never sit there again. The walls bore faint discolorations where photographs had once hung. Moments he couldn't bear to look at anymore, so he had taken them down one by one, as if erasing proof of a life that had unraveled too fast. The first drop of rain landed on the brim of his hat. Elias did not move. Storms came and went, they mirrored his existence. Fierce, cold, and temporary. When lightning split the distant sky, it revealed the empty fields stretching for miles, the fences sagging like tired bones. He had inherited this ranch from his father, worked it through drought and dust, and for a time believed it would become a home filled with laughter. That illusion had shattered the night his wife's cries were swallowed by thunder and the child they'd prayed for never drew breath. The land hadn't just taken them, it had taken the future too. He turned to go inside when something cut through the sound of rain. A knock. Not sharp or confident, but hesitant, as if the knocker wasn't sure whether they wanted to be answered. Elias froze, one hand on the doorframe. He lived miles from the nearest neighbor, and travelers rarely came this way after dark. Another knock followed, softer this time, almost pleading. He opened the door slowly. The lantern light spilled across the porch, illuminating a girl standing in the downpour. She couldn't have been more than 15, drenched from head to toe, her thin arms wrapped tightly around herself as though to keep from unraveling. Mud clung to her torn dress. Her hair stuck to her forehead in wet strands. Her eyes, though wide with fear, held a stubborn spark, like a match refusing to be snuffed out by the rain. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Elias saw in her the unmistakable look of someone who had run a long way from something unforgiving. She glanced past him into the house, not with greed or boldness, but the desperate hope of someone searching for warmth. He considered shutting the door. She was trouble, he could feel it. His life had no room for stray souls. It barely held together under his own weight. Yet something about her silence pressed against him. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. She simply stood there, shivering, as if letting him decide whether the storm or his indifference would finish what fate had started. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." She hesitated, distrust flickering across her face, but the cold won out. She slipped inside, water pooling beneath her feet. Elias closed the door against the wind and studied her carefully. Up close, the bruises on her wrists were visible, faint rings as though ropes had once claimed them. Dirt smudged her cheeks, but beneath it, she had the fragile sharpness of someone who'd learned to survive by watching everything and trusting no one. He handed her a wool blanket from the shelf near the fire. She took it without a word, clutching it around her shoulders as though she might disappear without its weight. Her gaze traveled around the room, noting the bare walls and the lack of softness in the furniture, as if cataloging what kind of man he might be. "You're far from town," he said finally. "What's your name?" She didn't answer. Her lips parted as if she might, but then closed again, guarded. He didn't push. He'd lived long enough to know that silence often held more truth than hurried explanations. He moved to the stove, stirred the embers, and added a log. The crackle filled the room. She edged closer to the warmth, still keeping her distance from him, like a stray animal unsure whether the hand extended meant food or a trap. Outside, thunder rolled, shaking the windows in their frames. The rain intensified, hammering the roof in relentless rhythm. Elias leaned against the table, arms folded, watching her with the weary caution of a man who had lost faith in unexpected arrivals. He didn't know why she'd come or what shadows followed her, but something deep in his chest, something he thought had died with his wife and unborn child, stirred uncomfortably. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "You can stay by the fire tonight." Just tonight. She nodded once, quick and sharp, like someone used to taking what little was offered without expecting more. As the storm raged outside, the house seemed less empty than it had an hour ago. The chair by the hearth remained vacant, but the presence of the girl, silent and watchful, filled the space with an unfamiliar tension. Elias knew this moment was not an end, but something was shifting beneath the surface, subtle and unstoppable, like water finding its way through stone. He didn't yet understand why he'd opened the door. He only knew that by morning his life would not be the same. Morning arrived reluctantly, dragging a gray mist across the fields as if the night had forgotten to lift its weight entirely. Elias stepped outside before the sun rose, as he always did, to check the fences and the livestock. The air was damp and heavy. The storm had left behind puddles that reflected the dull sky like broken mirrors. He welcomed the routine. Work was predictable, unlike people. People carried histories they didn't speak of, and he'd spent years building a life where no one else's burdens reached his door. But now, a stranger sat by his hearth, and that silence he valued so fiercely was already beginning to fracture. When he returned to the house, the girl was awake, wrapped tightly in the blanket he'd given her, sitting near the fireplace with a stiffness that betrayed both caution and exhaustion. She had the posture of someone prepared to run at the slightest sign of threat. Her eyes flicked toward him as he entered, quick and searching, then dropped again. She still hadn't spoken. Elias poured himself coffee, the sound of the tin cup against the wooden table louder than usual. He felt the weight of her presence pressing against every quiet corner of the room. He finally broke the silence. "You planning on staying mute forever?" The question wasn't cruel, just flat. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. For a moment, he thought she might remain stubbornly silent, but then a single word slipped out, hoarse and small. "No." It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. He nodded toward the basin. "There's water if you want to wash up. And bread on the shelf. Eat something." She moved cautiously, as if unsure whether the offer was a trap. Hunger won. She tore into the bread with quick, practiced bites, never turning her back on him. Elias watched her with a mix of irritation and reluctant curiosity. Whoever she was, she'd learned to survive like a cornered creature. Fast, silent, always watching. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated. Her throat worked, but the answer came slowly, as though names were dangerous things to hand out. "Clara." He repeated it quietly, testing the sound. Clara. It didn't suit the wild, guarded look in her eyes, but maybe that was the point. Names could be masks. "I'm Elias," he said. She gave a small nod but didn't offer anything more. He didn't press her. For now, the fragile thread of conversation was enough. He had no interest in playing savior. Whatever trouble she carried, he'd deal with it later, preferably by sending her on her way once the storm passed. Days settled into a strange rhythm. Clara didn't speak much, but she watched him constantly. When he fixed fences, she lingered nearby, her steps quiet on the damp earth. When he worked the horses, she stood at the edge of the corral, studying his movements with a sharpness that suggested she was memorizing everything. She wasn't lazy, that much was clear. One morning, without being asked, she gathered kindling before dawn and had the fire burning by the time Elias returned from the stables. She worked quickly and precisely, as though accustomed to chores that earned her keep. He told himself it was temporary. Once the roads dried and the storm's damage was repaired, he'd take her back to town, hand her over to someone else's care, and reclaim the silence he'd built his life around. But each day she stayed, the house shifted in subtle ways. Her footsteps became part of the background. The extra place sitting on the table stopped feeling like an intrusion. He began noticing how she flinched at sudden noises, how her eyes darted toward the door when riders passed on the distant road. She carried a fear that lived just beneath the surface, constant and taut, like a string ready to snap. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Elias found her standing by the fence, staring at the darkening fields. She was barefoot, her dress still threadbare despite being mended with spare cloth. For the first time, her posture wasn't defensive. It was tired, vulnerable. He approached quietly. She didn't turn, but she spoke before he could. I didn't think anyone would open the door." The admission hung between them like fragile glass. Elias said nothing, waiting. She glanced at him then, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "Most people don't look twice. They see someone like me and just keep walking." He understood that more than he wanted to admit. "Storm like that, leaving you outside would have been a death sentence," he said gruffly. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Wouldn't have been the first time someone tried to let the world finish what they started." He felt the words settle like stones in his chest. There were stories behind that sentence. Ugly ones. He didn't ask. Not yet. He sensed that if he pushed too hard, she'd retreat again, and whatever fragile trust had started to form would fracture beyond repair. Instead, he gestured toward the house. "Fire's dying down. Best come in before the cold sets in." She followed him back inside. It wasn't an apology, nor was it a promise, but it was something more valuable between two people who had lived too long with loss. A small, wordless agreement to keep moving forward. Later that night, long after the lamps were extinguished, Elias lay awake listening to the wind shift through the eaves. The girl's breathing from the adjoining room was soft but steady. For years, the house had been silent enough for him to hear the ticking of the old clock and the distant coyotes. Now that silence carried a new rhythm. Unfamiliar, fragile, but undeniably alive. He wasn't sure whether that unsettled him or offered a comfort he'd forgotten how to accept. As sleep finally crept in, one thought pressed against the edges of his mind with quiet persistence. Clara hadn't just knocked on his door. She'd unsettled the life he'd carefully built around emptiness. And though he didn't know her story yet, he sensed that whatever had brought her here was not finished with either of them.